Daniel's life was, in many ways, like that of any other 13-year-old boy growing up in a small town in the United States. His world revolved around school, family dinners, weekend trips to the park, and quiet moments spent in his room, lost in books or daydreaming about the future. He was not a remarkable student, nor was he particularly athletic. He was simply Daniel, curious, kind-hearted, and full of youthful dreams that had yet to be shaped by the weight of the world. His home, a modest but warm house on the outskirts of town, was his sanctuary. His parents, though often exhausted from the demands of daily life, made sure their children never felt unloved. His mother worked tirelessly, juggling her responsibilities at home while managing a part-time job at a local store. His father, a quiet but steady presence, did his best to shield his family from the growing financial pressures that seemed to loom over them like an unshakable storm cloud. Despite these struggles, their home was filled with love. Small joys punctuated their daily routine, his mother humming softly as she prepared dinner, the familiar scent of his father's coffee in the early hours of the morning, the giggles of his little sister, Emily, as she played with her stuffed animals. It was the kind of life that many families lived, imperfect, sometimes stressful, but ultimately bound together by love. But the world outside their home was changing. The news was always filled with stories of turmoil, rising costs, social unrest, families struggling to make ends meet. The sense of community that once held their town together seemed to be unraveling. Neighbors who once greeted each other with warm smiles now walked past in hurried silence, burdened by their own unseen struggles. Daniel, though young, could sense the shift. He noticed the worry lines etched into his mother's face, the quiet sighs of his father as he balanced the checkbook late at night. He didn't understand the complexities of the world, but he felt them. Even at school, he saw the signs of change. Friends who once played together so freely now argued over small things. Teachers spoke in hushed tones about budget cuts and declining resources. The weight of these concerns sat heavily on the shoulders of the adults around him, though they tried to shield the children from their fears. Still, Daniel found solace in the simple, familiar rhythms of his life. Dinners at the kitchen table were sacred, one of the few constants in an ever-changing world. Every evening, his family would gather, sharing stories of their day, laughing over inside jokes, and for a little while, forgetting about the worries that waited outside their front door. That night was no different. The air was crisp with the chill of winter seeping in through the windows, and the smell of his mother's homemade stew filled the house. Emily sat across from him, swinging her legs beneath the table as she recounted a story from Sunday school. His father, though weary, listened with an amused smile. Daniel felt safe in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of his family, unaware that their world was about to change forever. If this story has touched your heart so far, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Join our community where we share messages of faith, hope, and transformation. Your support helps us spread light to more people. The night had begun like so many others. The warmth of home, the scent of freshly cooked food, the quiet comfort of familiar voices filling the small dining room. Daniel had always loved these moments, when the world outside seemed distant, when laughter softened the weight of unspoken worries. His mother had just set a warm bowl of stew in front of him. His father reached for the salt, and Emily, animated as always, was in the middle of an enthusiastic retelling of her Sunday school lesson. Daniel listened, smiling slightly as his sister's small hands gestured wildly, her voice full of excitement. And then, in an instant, everything changed. A sharp gasp escaped Daniel's lips. His vision blurred, a sudden, crushing weight pressed against his chest. It felt as if the very air had been stolen from his lungs. His body tensed, his muscles locking in place. A strange, disorienting wave washed over him, pulling him away from the moment as though he were being submerged beneath an unseen force. Then, darkness. The chair beneath him scraped violently against the floor as his body collapsed. The spoon he had been holding clattered against the table, rolling to the ground with a metallic echo. His mother's scream pierced the stillness. "Daniel! Daniel!" Panic erupted around him. His father leapt from his chair, rushing to his side, while Emily's small hands trembled as she pressed them over her mouth, her wide eyes frozen in shock. "Call an ambulance!" his father shouted, his voice thick with terror. His mother fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely press the buttons. The air in the room had shifted. What had once been a haven of warmth and security was now a place of desperation. Daniel's body lay motionless on the hardwood floor. His skin turned a ghastly shade of pale, his lips tinged blue. His chest did not rise. He did not stir. His father knelt beside him, his hands pressing against Daniel's small frame, trying to find something, anything, some sign that his son was still there. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing through every possibility, every desperate prayer. Then the realization struck him. Daniel's heart had stopped. A strangled cry tore from his mother's throat as she dropped the phone, scrambling to hold her son's lifeless body in her arms. "No, no, no," she sobbed. "Not my baby." The seconds stretched into eternity, the room filled with the wails of a mother losing her child, with the desperate calls of a father demanding Daniel to wake up, with the choked murmurs of a little girl whispering a prayer she had learned only weeks before. And then, just as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Daniel's body lay still. 9 minutes. For 9 unbearable minutes, time stood frozen. 9 minutes of fear, 9 minutes of grief. 9 minutes of silence where a heartbeat should have been. And yet, none of them knew that Daniel was somewhere else entirely. If this story has touched your heart, leave a like and type Amen in the comments to receive blessings. Also, let us know which city you're watching from. We would love to send prayers your way. The silence was vast. It was not the absence of sound, but something deeper. An emptiness that stretched beyond anything Daniel had ever known. For the first time, he felt weightless, as though he were suspended in the air, untethered from his body. And then, he saw it. Below him, the scene unfolded with shocking clarity. He was floating, hovering in the air, looking down at the chaos beneath him. His mother cradled his lifeless form, rocking back and forth as sobs racked her body. His father pressed his hands against Daniel's chest, desperately attempting CPR, his face contorted with anguish. Little Emily knelt beside them, her tiny hands clenched in prayer, whispering the only words she knew to plead for a miracle. It was surreal. He should have felt afraid, but he didn't. Instead, an overwhelming calm embraced him, a peace that defied all logic. He felt lighter than air, as if a gentle force was cradling him, carrying him higher. The frantic scene below became more distant, the voices fading like echoes in a vast canyon. And then, a pull, gentle but firm. A golden light appeared ahead, stretching before him like an endless tunnel. It wasn't harsh or blinding, it was warm, radiant, filled with something deeper than mere illumination. It called to him, beckoning him forward. The whispers began, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, then growing clearer. "You are not finished yet. Remember what you see." The words resonated deep within him, vibrating through every part of his being. His soul recognized them even before his mind could process their meaning. Daniel drifted forward, drawn toward the light. The world he had known, his home, his family, the dining room where his body still lay, began to dissolve. fading like the last traces of a dream, and in its place, something new emerged. A realm unlike anything he had ever seen. The golden light stretched across an endless horizon, bathing everything in an unshakable serenity. It was more than beauty, it was belonging. Every fiber of his soul felt at home, as if he had always known this place but had simply forgotten. The warmth here was not just external, it filled him from within, wrapping him in a love so vast, so complete, that it left him breathless. There was no pain, no fear, no sorrow, only peace. He wanted to stay, but deep within him something stirred, a knowing, an understanding he could not yet explain. His journey was far from over. As Daniel moved deeper into the golden realm, a presence began to form before him. At first it was light, a brilliance so pure and radiant that it seemed to pulse with life itself. But as he gazed upon it, the light took shape, becoming a figure of undeniable authority and overwhelming love. Jesus. Daniel's soul recognized him instantly. It wasn't just his appearance, though he was resplendent, clothed in a brilliance beyond earthly comprehension. It was the way his presence filled everything. The warmth, the peace, the love that permeated this place, it all radiated from him. Daniel was speechless. His heart swelled with an emotion he had no words for. He wanted to fall to his knees, to weep, to run into the arms of the one who stood before him. Jesus smiled, a smile that seemed to hold the universe itself. "Daniel," he spoke, his voice rich and deep, filled with power yet infinitely gentle. "You have been chosen to deliver an important message." As he spoke, vivid images began to flood Daniel's mind. At first they were glimpses, flashes of a world familiar yet broken. Cities swallowed by flames, forests turned to ash, waters rising and swallowing entire towns. The sky itself seemed to groan as storms raged across the earth. It was devastation, chaos, a world teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Daniel trembled. His voice, small and afraid, broke as he asked, "Why are you showing me this?" Jesus' expression was calm but firm. "Because the world has lost its way. It has forgotten love, faith, and unity." The visions did not stop. He saw families torn apart by anger, neighbors who had once shared kindness now divided by hatred. Greed, selfishness, and fear had taken root in the hearts of humanity. He watched as people turned their backs on one another, blind to the suffering they caused. Tears filled Daniel's eyes. It was too much. The weight of it pressed on his soul. "But there is still time," Jesus said. Daniel looked up at him, hope flickering in his chest. "You must tell them to return to God, to one another. Only through kindness, forgiveness, and faith can they overcome what is to come." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He was just a boy. How could he carry such a message? Jesus, sensing his fear, stepped closer, placing a hand over Daniel's heart. The warmth that surged through him was unlike anything he had ever felt. Pure love, pure strength. "Do not be afraid," Jesus reassured him. "You are never alone. I am always with you." And in that moment, Daniel knew. This was his mission. Daniel stood frozen, his heart pounding with the weight of Jesus' words. The visions he had shown him still burned in his mind, flames devouring cities, waters swallowing homes, hearts hardened by division and fear. It was too much, too immense. He was just a boy. How could he possibly carry such a burden? Jesus, as if hearing his very thoughts, spoke again. "You are not alone, Daniel. My light is within you." As he placed his hand on Daniel's chest, a warmth unlike anything he had ever known filled him. It was as if his soul had been set ablaze, not with fear, but with an unshakable certainty. The love, the strength, the purpose, it all flowed through him in an overwhelming wave. Jesus' gaze was filled with infinite love. "Tell them, Daniel. Tell them that redemption is still possible. The world is not beyond saving, but they must turn back to love, to faith, to unity. Only then will the darkness retreat. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. He could feel the truth of what Jesus was saying. It wasn't just a lesson, it was a calling, a responsibility. The weight of it settled over him, not as a burden, but as a mission. And then the world around him began to shift. The golden realm, the warmth of heaven, the indescribable peace, everything started to fade. "Wait!" Daniel pleaded, his hands reaching out, desperation rising in his chest. He didn't want to leave. Not this place. Not him. Jesus smiled again, a look of deep understanding in his eyes. "It is not your time to stay. There is work to be done." The light around Daniel intensified, growing brighter and brighter until he could no longer see. His very being felt as if it was being pulled, drawn back by an unseen force, rushing towards something familiar, yet distant. The warmth of Jesus' hand was the last thing he felt before. A sharp gasp, a jolt of air flooding his lungs, and then pain, cold, voices, the blinding brightness of hospital lights. He was back. A sharp gasp tore through the silence. Air surged into Daniel's lungs like a crashing wave, his body convulsing as life was suddenly, miraculously restored to him. The sound of frantic voices filled the room, doctors shouting in disbelief, machines beeping in alarm, but amid the chaos, there was one voice that cut through it all. "Daniel!" His mother's sobs were thick with emotion, her hands trembling as she clutched his face, her fingers brushing away strands of damp hair from his forehead. Her eyes, swollen with tears, searched his, as if she were afraid that if she blinked, he would disappear again. "You're back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My baby, you're back." Daniel's body felt heavy, like he had been pulled from the depths of a vast ocean. His limbs ached, his head pounded, but none of it compared to the storm raging inside him, because he remembered. He remembered everything: the golden light, the realm of peace, the overwhelming love that had filled his soul, the voice of Jesus, his touch, the mission entrusted to him, and the visions. His heart clenched as the images resurfaced, flames consuming cities, families torn apart, a world on the brink of ruin. It was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't some illusion brought on by his unconscious mind. He had been there. He had spoken to Jesus, and now he was here, back in this world, back in his fragile human body. Tears welled in his mother's eyes as she clutched his hand, pressing it against her cheek. His father stood at the edge of the bed, silent, his normally strong expression cracked with raw emotion. Emily, too small to understand the weight of what had just happened, clung to their mother's arm, her wide eyes full of awe. The doctor, who had been frantically checking the monitors, finally spoke. His voice was tinged with something that sounded like disbelief. This is impossible." His gaze flickered between Daniel and the machines, the numbers on the screen showing a steady, strong heartbeat. A heartbeat that had been gone for 9 minutes. He was gone. But Daniel wasn't gone. He was more alive than ever. Daniel sat in the hospital bed, his fingers lightly gripping the blanket draped over him. His body was weak, his limbs still trembling from the ordeal, but his mind was clear, clearer than it had ever been. The weight of what he had seen, of what he had been entrusted with, pressed heavily on him. The fire, the floods, the division, the suffering, it was all real. It was coming. And yet, amid the chaos of those visions, there had been hope, a way forward, a way to change what was coming. His mother wiped her eyes, still unable to believe that her son, who had been cold and lifeless only moments ago, was now awake, alive. His father, usually a man of quiet strength, stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his face pale, his hands gripping the rail, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. The doctors murmured in the background, whispering words like miracle and unexplainable. They had seen death before. They had declared Daniel lost. And yet here he was. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. He had to speak. He had to tell them. "Mom." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. His mother leaned in immediately, her hands gently cupping his face. "I saw him." The room seemed to still, his mother's brows furrowed. "Saw who, sweetheart?" Daniel took a slow, shaky breath. "Jesus." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The doctors exchanged uncertain glances, their skepticism evident, but his mother froze. Her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. What do you mean, Daniel?" she asked softly, her fingers tightening around his hand. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the warmth still lingering in his soul. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't dreaming. He had been there. He had seen him. "He spoke to me," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "He showed me things about the world, about what's coming." His father shifted, his usually composed face filled with unease. "Son, you've been through a traumatic experience. Maybe you..." "No." Daniel's voice came out sharper than he intended. "It wasn't a dream. It was real." He searched their faces, desperate for them to believe him, desperate to make them understand. "Mom, Dad, something is coming. Jesus showed me. The world is losing its way. People are turning against each other, forgetting love, forgetting faith. But there's still time." Tears pooled in his mother's eyes as she reached for his face, her thumb gently stroking his cheek. "Still time for what, baby?" Daniel swallowed hard. To turn back, to return to God, to love again, to forgive. Before it's too late. His words settled over them like a wave, thick with urgency and truth. His father looked away, his jaw tight, his emotions unreadable. His mother let out a small sob, pressing a trembling hand over her lips. Emily, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke, her tiny voice cutting through the tension. "Did Jesus say we were going to be okay?" Daniel turned to her, his heart aching at the innocence in her big, hopeful eyes. He said, "It's up to us." The days that followed Daniel's return were unlike anything his family had ever experienced. The news of his miraculous survival spread quickly through the hospital, then through their town, and soon beyond. People came to visit, not just out of curiosity, but because they felt something different, something powerful in his presence. Daniel didn't argue with those who doubted him. He didn't try to prove what he had seen. He simply spoke the truth Jesus had placed in his heart. "It's not too late," he would say, his voice steady and unwavering. "We can still change what's coming, but we must love, we must forgive, we must return to faith." Some dismissed him, others wept at his words, and some, those who had been searching, those who had been lost, found something in Daniel's message that reignited a fire in their hearts. His mother was the first to change. She began to pray again, not just in moments of desperation, but with hope, with gratitude. His father, ever the skeptic, spent more time in silence, reflecting, watching, listening, and Emily, sweet, innocent Emily, never let go of Daniel's hand, always whispering little prayers under her breath, as if she knew now, more than ever, that heaven was listening. But it wasn't just his family. Something was shifting. People who heard Daniel's story began reaching out to one another, rebuilding what had been broken. Friendships, marriages, families. Those who had turned away from faith started returning, seeking the presence of God they had once forgotten. Acts of kindness multiplied, as if a wave of love had been unleashed upon the world. It wasn't the end of suffering. It wasn't the end of trials. But it was the beginning of something new, a spark in the darkness, a reminder that even in the face of destruction, redemption is always within reach. One night, as Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he felt it again, that warmth, that presence. He didn't need to see Jesus to know he was there. "I will never leave you," the words echoed softly in his heart. And Daniel knew his journey was only beginning. If this story has touched your heart, leave a like and type Amen in the comments to receive blessings. We would love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments so we can pray for you. But don't stop here. There's something even more powerful waiting for you. Click on the next video appearing on your screen. It holds a revelation that will strengthen your faith and change your life forever. Don't miss it. God bless you. Amen.